Pregnant woman in labor, hospital shaken as 20 monsters are born. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Evelyn sat in the back seat of the car, clutching her swollen belly as waves of pain rippled through her body. Her breath came in short, labored gasps, and her fingers dug into the upholstery with each contraction. Jacob glanced nervously at her from the driver's seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "We're almost there," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Just hang on, Evelyn. The hospital's 5 minutes away." Evelyn didn't respond. She was too focused on the tightening pain that seemed to grow more unbearable with each passing second. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and her heart raced. But it wasn't just the pain of labor that terrified her, it was the knowledge of what was to come. She had tried to warn Jacob, tried to explain that this pregnancy wasn't normal. But every time she brought it up, he dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to stress or hormonal changes. "Every pregnancy is different," he had said, brushing her fears aside. "You're just overthinking it." Now, as the contractions came closer together, Evelyn's mind raced. She had seen the signs for months, the strange movements that didn't feel like a baby's kick, the way her stomach seemed to twist unnaturally under her skin, the vivid nightmares that left her drenched in sweat. She had even gone to a doctor in secret, desperate for answers, but the scans and tests had only raised more questions. The doctor's face had gone pale as he reviewed the results, and he muttered something about abnormalities before abruptly ending the appointment. Jacob pulled into the hospital's emergency entrance, slamming on the brakes. "We're here," he said, jumping out of the car and rushing to her side. He opened the door and helped her out, his hands trembling as he supported her weight. Evelyn gritted her teeth as another contraction hit, nearly doubling her over. A nurse appeared with a wheelchair, and Jacob quickly helped her into it. The nurse, a young woman with kind eyes, asked Evelyn a series of questions as they wheeled her inside. "How far apart are the contractions?" 2, maybe 3 minutes, Evelyn managed to say between gasps. "Any complications with the pregnancy?" Evelyn hesitated, her eyes flicking to Jacob. "No," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse nodded, unaware of the tension that hung in the air. She wheeled Evelyn into a delivery room, where a team of doctors and nurses were already preparing for the birth. The room smelled of antiseptic, the bright overhead lights casting a sterile glow. "All right, Mrs. Harper," said Dr. Bennett, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor. "We're going to take good care of you. Let's get you settled." Evelyn climbed onto the bed with Jacob's help, her body trembling from the effort. The monitors beeped softly as the nurses attached sensors to her belly, and Dr. Bennett studied the screen with a furrowed brow. He murmured, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" Jacob asked, his voice edged with panic. "It's nothing," Dr. Bennett said quickly, though the look in his eyes betrayed his words. "Sometimes the readings can be a little unusual at first. Let's just keep monitoring." Evelyn winced as another contraction tore through her, gripping Jacob's hand tightly. Her nails dug into his skin, but he didn't complain. He could see the pain etched across her face, and it broke his heart. "You're doing great, Evelyn," he said, his voice trembling. "Just a little longer." Evelyn wanted to believe him, but deep down, she knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary delivery. The flickering shadows on the monitor screen seemed to move in unnatural patterns, almost as if they had a life of their own. The nurses murmured to each other, their voices hushed, and Evelyn caught snippets of their conversation. "Did you see that? Could be a glitch? I've never seen anything like it." She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound, but the words echoed in her mind. Her breathing grew ragged as the contractions intensified, each one sending shockwaves of pain through her body. Dr. Bennett stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "All right, Evelyn, it's time to start pushing. On the next contraction, I need you to give it everything you've got." Evelyn nodded weakly, her grip on Jacob's hand tightening. The next contraction hit like a tidal wave, and she screamed, pushing with all her strength. The room seemed to blur around her, the pain consuming everything. "You're doing great," Dr. Bennett said. "I can see the head. Just one more big push." Evelyn gritted her teeth, tears streaming down her face as she pushed again. The pressure reached its peak, and then, suddenly, it was gone. She collapsed back onto the bed, gasping for air. "It's out," Dr. Bennett said, his voice laced with relief. "Wait, what the—" A sharp, high-pitched screech filled the room, cutting through the air like a knife. Evelyn opened her eyes just in time to see the doctor stagger back, dropping something onto the floor. Her heart skipped a beat as she caught sight of it. The thing lying on the floor was not a baby. It was small and green, its slimy skin glistening under the fluorescent lights. Multiple eyes blinked in unison, and tiny tentacles writhed around its body. It let out another screech, its mouth filled with jagged, needle-like teeth. One of the nurses screamed, dropping the tray she was holding. Instruments clattered to the floor, and chaos erupted in the room. "What is that?" Jacob shouted, his face pale. Evelyn stared at the creature, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. It's them," she whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Bennett regained his composure, stepping forward cautiously. "It's not possible," he muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This can't be real." The creature scurried across the floor, moving with unnatural speed. One of the nurses tried to corner it, but it hissed, baring its teeth, and leapt onto the wall. It clung there for a moment before disappearing into a vent. "Seal that vent," Dr. Bennett shouted, but it was too late. The creature was gone. Evelyn's body convulsed as another contraction hit, and she let out a guttural scream. "They're not done," she cried. "There's more." The nurses exchanged panicked glances, unsure of what to do. Dr. Bennett hesitated for only a moment before stepping back to the bed. "We have to keep going," he said, his voice firm. "We need to deliver the rest." Jacob stared at him in horror. "Are you insane? Did you see what just came out of her?" Dr. Bennett turned to him, his expression grim. "If we don't deliver them, she could die." Jacob clenched his fists, torn between his fear and his love for Evelyn. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "Do whatever you have to do. Just save her." The team sprang into action, their earlier panic replaced by a grim determination. Evelyn screamed again as the next contraction hit, her body racked with pain. Another creature emerged, its slimy skin glistening as it screeched and writhed. And then another, and another. One by one, the monsters came, each more grotesque than the last. The room filled with the sound of their screeches, their tiny bodies scurrying across the floor and disappearing into the shadows. The staff tried to contain them, but it was like trying to catch smoke. Evelyn's screams grew weaker with each delivery, her body trembling from exhaustion. Jacob stood by her side, his hand on her shoulder as tears streamed down his face. "Stay with me, Evelyn," he whispered. "You're strong. You can get through this?" Evelyn looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I tried to tell you." "Right?" Jacob shook his head, his voice breaking. "Don't apologize. Just focus on staying with me, okay? We'll figure this out." But deep down, he wasn't sure if they could. The room was a scene of chaos and horror, and the creatures showed no signs of stopping. He could feel the weight of their presence, lurking just out of sight, waiting for their moment to strike. And in that moment, Jacob realized that their nightmare was only beginning. The delivery room was a war zone. Blood spattered the floor, mixing with the thick, green slime left behind by the monstrous offspring. The overhead lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Nurses scrambled to contain the chaos, their faces pale with terror, while Dr. Bennett barked orders in a desperate attempt to maintain control. "Close that door," he shouted, pointing to one of the nurses. "We can't let any more of them escape." But it was too late. The creatures were faster than anyone could have anticipated. One scurried up the wall, its needle-like claws clicking against the tiles, before slipping through a vent in the ceiling. Another darted under the cabinets, vanishing into the dark recesses of the room. A third lunged at a nurse, its tiny teeth bared, and sank its fangs into her arm. She screamed, dropping the tray she was holding, and collapsed to the floor. "Get her out of here," Dr. Bennett yelled, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of screeches and cries. Two other nurses rushed to drag their injured colleague out of the room, their faces contorted with fear. Evelyn lay on the bed, her body trembling as the contractions came faster and harder. Her breaths were shallow, her skin pale and slick with sweat. She was barely conscious, her head lolling to the side as she muttered incoherently. "They're here, they're all here," she whispered, her voice a weak rasp. I told you they were coming." Jacob knelt beside her, gripping her hand tightly. "Stay with me, Evelyn," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "You're going to be okay. We're going to get through this." Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's too late. They're not just babies. They're part of something bigger." Jacob stared at her, his mind racing. "What do you mean? What's bigger?" Before she could answer, another contraction ripped through her body, and she let out a guttural scream. Dr. Bennett rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he prepared for the next delivery. "Another one is coming," he said, his voice tight with tension. "This might be the last one." Jacob stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't think he could bear to see another creature emerge. Each one had been more horrifying than the last, their unnatural forms defying all logic. And yet, he couldn't leave Evelyn's side. She needed him, now more than ever. Evelyn let out one final scream, her body convulsing as the creature emerged. Dr. Bennett caught it in his gloved hands, his face a mask of horror as he stared at the thing writhing in his grip. This one was larger than the others, its body covered in sharp spines that glistened with a dark, viscous fluid. Its multiple eyes blinked in unison, and its gaping mouth let out a high-pitched shriek that made Jacob's ears ring. Dr. Bennett stumbled back, dropping the creature onto the floor. It hissed, its spines bristling, and scuttled toward the door. One of the nurses tried to block its path, but it leapt at her, its claws slashing across her face. She fell to the ground, blood streaming from her wounds, as the creature disappeared into the hallway. "Enough!" Jacob shouted, his voice echoing through the room. He turned to Dr. Bennett, his eyes blazing with anger. "We need to stop this. We can't just let them keep escaping." Dr. Bennett shook his head, his expression grim. "What do you suggest we do? We're barely holding on as it is." Jacob's mind raced as he looked around the room. The delivery bed, the monitors, the blood-soaked floor, it all felt surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. And then his eyes landed on Evelyn's hospital bag, sitting in the corner. Something about it caught his attention, a nagging feeling he couldn't ignore. He rushed to the bag and unzipped it, his hands trembling. Inside, he found the usual items, a change of clothes, toiletries, a book, but at the bottom of the bag was something he hadn't seen before. It was an old, leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and its cover embossed with strange symbols. "What is this?" he muttered, pulling the journal out and flipping through its pages. The handwriting was messy and uneven, filled with strange diagrams and cryptic notes. Words like summoning, ritual, and gatekeeper jumped out at him, sending a chill down his spine. "What are you doing?" Dr. Bennett asked, his voice filled with frustration. "We don't have time for this." Jacob ignored him, his eyes scanning the pages as he pieced together the fragments of information. The journal seemed to be a guide of some kind, describing a ritual that could seal the creatures away. But it wasn't complete. There were gaps, missing instructions that made it impossible to fully understand. "Evelyn," Jacob said, rushing back to her side. He held up the journal, his voice urgent. "What is this? Did you know about this?" Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at the journal with a mixture of fear and recognition. It's my grandmother's," she said weakly. "She warned me, she said this would happen." Jacob's heart sank. "You knew? You knew this would happen, and you didn't tell me?" "I tried," Evelyn said, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't believe me." "No one did." Jacob felt a wave of guilt wash over him. She had tried to warn him, and he had dismissed her fears as irrational. Now they were living a nightmare, and it was all spiraling out of control. Dr. Bennett stepped closer, his voice low. "What does it say? Can it help us stop this?" Jacob flipped through the pages again, his eyes scanning the cryptic text. "It's a ritual," he said, his voice trembling. "It says we can seal the creatures away, but it's incomplete. I don't know how to finish it." Evelyn let out a weak laugh, her voice tinged with bitterness. "It doesn't matter," she said. "They're already here. You can't stop them now." Jacob shook his head, refusing to give up. "There has to be a way," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not letting them win. I'm not losing you." Before Evelyn could respond, a loud crash echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of screams. The creatures were spreading, their numbers growing as they attacked anyone in their path. Jacob knew they were running out of time. He clutched the journal tightly, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the fragments of the ritual. If he could just figure out the missing pieces, they might have a chance. But he needed Evelyn's help. She was the key to all of this. "Evelyn," he said, leaning close to her. "I need you to fight. I need you to help me. Please." Evelyn looked at him, her eyes filled with pain and fear. "I don't know if I can," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You can," Jacob said firmly. "You're the strongest person I know. We can end this, together." Evelyn's lips trembled, and she nodded weakly. She said, "I'll try." Jacob turned to Dr. Bennett and the remaining nurses. "We need to barricade this room," he said. "No one else goes in or out. And if you see one of those things, kill it." Dr. Bennett hesitated for a moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "Let's do it." As the team moved to secure the room, Jacob sat beside Evelyn, the journal open in his lap. He didn't know if they had enough time, or if they could even complete the ritual. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't giving up. Not on Evelyn. Not on anyone. The creatures might have been born in chaos, but Jacob was determined to end their reign. No matter the cost. The hospital had become a scene of utter devastation. Outside the barricaded delivery room, the once sterile corridors were painted in blood and carnage. The creatures moved as a swarm now, scuttling through vents and crashing through doors, their screeches piercing the silence. Patients and staff fled in terror, but there was no escaping the relentless horde. Inside the delivery room, Jacob worked feverishly, flipping through the pages of the journal while Evelyn lay weak and barely conscious on the bed. The cryptic symbols and diagrams blurred together in his mind, but he forced himself to focus. Each page described fragments of a ritual, a series of chants and symbols meant to seal away something ancient and malevolent. "This journal, it's incomplete," Jacob muttered, his voice shaking. "There are gaps everywhere. How are we supposed to do this?" Dr. Bennett, standing by the door with a scalpel in his trembling hand, glanced over at Jacob. "We don't have a choice," he said. "If we don't try, those things will destroy everyone in this hospital, and maybe more." Evelyn stirred, her voice barely audible. "The ritual, it has to be done where they were born," she said, her words slurring as if it took all her energy to speak. "It's the only way to sever the connection." Jacob froze. "The delivery room?" he asked, his stomach sinking. He looked around at the blood-slicked floor, the flickering lights, the lingering stench of the monsters that had emerged from Evelyn's body. "How are we supposed to do it here?" Evelyn managed a faint smile, though her eyes were filled with pain. "You'll figure it out. You always do." Jacob swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He had never felt so helpless. He wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything that would make the nightmare end. But instead, he focused on Evelyn's face, drawing strength from her fragile determination. "I'll figure it out," he said, his voice steadying. "I promise." Outside, the creatures moved as if driven by a singular purpose. They weren't just attacking indiscriminately, they were converging. The swarm began to circle the delivery room, their screeches echoing through the vents and walls. It was as if they knew what was happening inside, as if they could sense Jacob's attempt to stop them. Dr. Bennett stood by the door, his breath coming in short gasps as the sounds grew louder. "They're coming," he said, his voice laced with fear. "We won't be able to hold them off." Jacob ignored him, his eyes glued to the journal. He had found a passage that seemed promising, a series of chants written in an unfamiliar language. Next to the text were symbols that looked like they could be drawn on the floor. A circle with jagged edges, intersected by lines that formed a star. "This has to be it," Jacob said, grabbing a marker from a nearby tray. He dropped to his knees and began drawing the symbols on the floor, his hands shaking as he worked. "What are you doing?" Dr. Bennett asked, his voice rising in panic. "The ritual needs a focus point," Jacob explained, his words coming quickly. "This symbol, it's supposed to anchor them. If we can complete the chant, it might stop them." Dr. Bennett hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Tell me what to do." Jacob glanced at him. "Keep them out," he said simply. "We need time." Dr. Bennett turned back to the door, gripping the scalpel tightly as the sounds of claws and screeches grew louder. The creatures were near now. He could feel their presence, a suffocating weight pressing against the barricade. He glanced at the nurse who had stayed behind, her face pale but determined. "Find anything you can use as a weapon," Dr. Bennett told her. "We're going to need it." The nurse nodded, grabbing a metal tray and positioning herself near the door. They both knew it wouldn't be enough, but it was all they had. As Jacob finished drawing the symbols, he turned back to Evelyn. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale as death, but her eyes flickered open when he called her name. "Evelyn," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I need you to help me. I can't do this alone." Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came out at first. She struggled to focus on him, her voice barely a whisper when she finally spoke. What do you need?" Jacob held up the journal. "There's a chant. I think it's what binds them. You're their mother. You're connected to them. If we do this together, we can stop them." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. They're a part of me," she said, her voice breaking. "I can feel them. I can't hurt them." Jacob's heart ached at her words, but he forced himself to stay calm. "They're not your children, Evelyn," he said gently. "They're monsters. If we don't stop them, they'll kill everyone here, and more." Evelyn closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered. "I didn't want any of this." "I know," Jacob said, his voice trembling. "But you're the only one who can stop it. Please, Evel, I need you." For a long moment, Evelyn was silent. Then, slowly she nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll try." The first creature slammed into the barricaded door with a force that made the entire room shudder. Dr. Bennett and the nurse pressed their weight against the makeshift barricade, but they could feel it weakening with each impact. "They're breaking through," the nurse cried, her voice tinged with panic. "Just hold them off," Jacob shouted, his voice echoing in the room. He knelt beside Evelyn, the journal open in his lap. "Evelyn, repeat after me." He began to recite the chant, his voice unsteady as he stumbled over the unfamiliar words. Evelyn joined in, her voice weak and trembling, but together, they created a fragile harmony that seemed to resonate in the air. The creatures outside the room screeched louder, their movements growing more frantic. It was as if the chant was affecting them, disrupting their connection to Evelyn. "It's working," Jacob muttered, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Keep going." Evelyn's voice grew stronger, her words more confident as she continued the chant. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, their jagged edges pulsating with an otherworldly light. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made Jacob's skin tingle. The barricade cracked as the first creature forced its way through, its clawed hand reaching for Dr. Bennett. He slashed at it with the scalpel, cutting deep into its slimy flesh, but the creature barely flinched. It lunged at him, knocking him to the ground. The nurse screamed, swinging the metal tray at the creature's head. The blow connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature let out a screech before collapsing to the floor. But more were coming, their shadows flickering in the hallway. "Jacob," Dr. Bennett shouted, his voice filled with fear. "We can't hold them off much longer." Jacob didn't respond. He and Evelyn were lost in the chant, their voices rising in unison as the symbols on the floor burned brighter. The light spread, forming a circle around the bed that seemed to push back the darkness. The creatures hesitated, their screeches faltering as the light grew. It was as if they could sense the power of the ritual, a force that threatened to sever their connection to Evelyn. Jacob's voice broke as he shouted the final words of the chant. his hands gripping Evelyn's as the room erupted in a blinding light. The creatures let out one last ear-piercing screech before they began to dissolve, their bodies turning to ash that scattered in the air. When the light faded, the room was silent. The creatures were gone, their presence erased as if they had never existed. Evelyn lay still on the bed, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Jacob knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "It's over," he whispered, his voice filled with relief. "We did it." Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a faint smile. "I knew you'd figure it out," she said weakly. Jacob laughed softly, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't have done it without you." Dr. Bennett and the nurse stared at the scene in stunned silence, their faces pale and their bodies trembling. They had survived, but the horrors they had witnessed would haunt them forever. As Jacob held Evelyn's hand, he felt a flicker of hope. They had faced the unimaginable and survived. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The room was eerily quiet now, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath. Jacob sat beside Evelyn, his fingers interlocked with hers as he watched her chest rise and fall in shallow, unsteady breaths. Her face was pale, her lips cracked and dry, but there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes, a fragile sense of peace after the chaos they had just endured. Dr. Bennett slowly stood, his legs trembling beneath him. The scalpel in his hand was coated in dark green slime, and his once pristine white coat was stained with blood and ichor. He glanced at the ash scattered across the floor where the creatures had once stood, his face a mask of disbelief. "Are they gone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob nodded, though his own voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "I think so. The ritual, it worked." The nurse, still clutching the bent metal tray she had used as a weapon, let out a shaky breath. She dropped the tray with a loud clang, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. "I can't believe we survived that," she murmured, her voice cracking with emotion. Jacob turned his attention back to Evelyn, his thumb gently brushing against the back of her hand. "Evelyn, it's over," he said softly. "You're safe now." Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with a weak smile. "Safe," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "But at what cost?" Jacob's chest tightened at her words. She had been through so much, more than anyone should ever have to endure. And yet, she had found the strength to fight, to help him finish the ritual and banish the horrors that had come from her body. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "We'll figure it out," he promised. "One step at a time." But even as he spoke the words, a lingering unease settled over him. The ritual had worked, yes, but the journal had been incomplete. He couldn't help but wonder if they had truly closed the door on whatever force had created the creatures, or if they had merely delayed the inevitable. The survivors in the hospital began to emerge from their hiding places, their faces pale and haunted. The halls were littered with debris, overturned carts, shattered glass, and the remnants of the creatures that had been destroyed. The air was thick with the acrid stench of blood and burned flesh, and the faint sound of sobbing echoed through the corridors. Jacob helped Evelyn sit up, her body still weak and trembling. Dr. Bennett and the nurse worked quickly to clean her wounds and check her vitals, though their hands shook with every movement. The weight of what they had just witnessed hung heavy in the air, an unspoken tension that none of them could shake. "We need to get out of here," Dr. Bennett said finally, breaking the silence. "This hospital, it's not safe anymore." Jacob nodded in agreement. "Is there a way to reach the emergency exits? Somewhere we can get help?" The nurse hesitated, her eyes darting to the doorway as if she expected one of the creatures to return at any moment. "The main exits are blocked," she said, "but there's a service elevator at the end of the hall. It leads to the basement and a back entrance." Jacob glanced at Evelyn, concern etched across his face. "Can she move?" he asked, his voice tight with worry. "She'll need support," Dr. Bennett replied. "But if we move quickly, we can get her out of here." Jacob slipped an arm around Evelyn's shoulders, helping her off the bed. She winced as her feet touched the cold floor, her legs wobbling beneath her. "I've got you," Jacob murmured, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "Lean on me." Evelyn nodded weakly, her fingers clutching at his arm as they began to move toward the door. Dr. Bennett led the way, the nurse close behind, as they stepped into the hallway. The scene before them was one of utter devastation. The walls were smeared with blood, the floor littered with broken equipment and discarded medical supplies. A gurney lay overturned, its wheels spinning slowly in the dim light. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional crackle of a distant intercom. Jacob's grip on Evelyn tightened as they moved cautiously down the hall. Every shadow, every flicker of movement, sent a jolt of fear through him. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the creatures hadn't been completely eradicated. As they approached the service elevator, the nurse pressed the button, her hands trembling. The light above the doors flickered, and a low hum filled the air as the elevator began its slow ascent. Come on, the nurse whispered, her voice filled with desperation. The doors finally slid open with a metallic groan, revealing the dimly lit interior of the elevator. Jacob helped Evelyn inside, followed closely by Dr. Bennett and the nurse. The elevator creaked and groaned as it descended, the faint sound of machinery echoing in the confined space. Jacob kept his arm around Evelyn, his other hand clutching the journal tightly. He couldn't bring himself to let it go, not after everything it had revealed. The cryptic symbols and fragmented instructions still haunted him, a reminder of the horrors they had faced. When the elevator doors opened, they stepped into the basement, the air damp and heavy with the smell of mildew. The faint glow of emergency lights illuminated the narrow corridor ahead, casting long shadows on the walls. The back entrance is just down this hall, the nurse said, her voice barely above a whisper. If we can make it outside, we should be safe. Jacob nodded, his grip on Evelyn steady as they moved forward. But as they reached the end of the hall, a sudden noise stopped them in their tracks, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls. What was that? Dr. Bennett whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Jacob tightened his grip on the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't know, he said, his voice trembling. But we need to keep moving. They quickened their pace, the growls growing louder as they neared the exit. Jacob's mind raced, his thoughts a jumble of fear and determination. They were so close to escaping this nightmare. But as they reached the door, it burst open with a deafening crash. A massive creature loomed before them, its body grotesque and towering, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It let out a bone-chilling roar, its jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the creature. It was unlike anything they had seen before, larger, more monstrous, its presence radiating an almost palpable malice. Run! He shouted, his voice breaking the paralysis that had gripped them. Dr. Bennett and the nurse scrambled back, but the creature lunged forward, its massive claws swiping through the air. Jacob pushed Evelyn behind him, his heart pounding as he held the journal like a shield. The creature's glowing eyes locked onto Evelyn, its movements predatory and deliberate. Jacob's mind raced, the fragmented instructions from the journal flashing through his thoughts. The symbols, he muttered, his voice frantic. The symbols can stop it? Dr. Bennett grabbed a piece of broken pipe from the ground, swinging it wildly as he tried to distract the creature. Do whatever you have to do, he shouted. Jacob dropped to his knees, flipping to the page in the journal that described the binding symbol. He tore off his jacket, using the marker to scrawl the symbol across the fabric as quickly as he could. His hands shook, but he forced himself to focus. The creature roared, its claws swiping dangerously close to Dr. Bennett. The nurse screamed, backing against the wall as the beast turned its attention toward her. Jacob finished the symbol, holding it up like a talisman. Over here, he shouted, his voice filled with a desperate courage. The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it turned toward Jacob. It let out a low growl, its massive body tense as it stalked forward. Jacob held the makeshift talisman high, his voice steady as he began to recite the chant from the journal. The words felt foreign and heavy on his tongue, but he pushed through, his voice growing louder with each syllable. The creature roared in defiance, its movements faltering as the symbol began to glow faintly. Jacob's heart raced as he continued the chant, the light from the symbol intensifying with each word. Dr. Bennett grabbed Evelyn, pulling her back as the creature thrashed and roared, its body writhing in pain. The light from the symbol grew brighter, casting long shadows on the walls. "Keep going," Dr. Bennett shouted, his voice filled with hope. Jacob's voice reached a crescendo, the chant echoing through the corridor. The creature let out one final ear-piercing roar before it collapsed to the ground, its massive body dissolving into ash. The corridor fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Jacob lowered the talisman, his hands trembling as he stared at the pile of ash before him. "It's over," he whispered, his voice filled with exhaustion and relief. But deep down, he knew the fight was far from finished. The hallway was deathly silent, the remnants of the massive creature scattered across the floor in a pile of smoldering ash. Jacob's body shook with exhaustion as he clutched the now-dim talisman, the journal still cradled tightly in his other hand. His breaths came in ragged gasps, and he could feel his legs threatening to give out beneath him. Behind him, Dr. Bennett helped Evelyn to her feet, her body still trembling from the ordeal. The nurse leaned heavily against the wall, her face pale but determined to keep moving. The glowing emergency lights cast an eerie glow on their faces, and the oppressive quiet of the corridor seemed to weigh on all of them. "We have to keep going," Jacob said finally, his voice hoarse but resolute. "We're not safe here." Evelyn let out a weak laugh, her head lolling against Dr. Bennett's shoulder. "Safe," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't think we'll ever be safe again." Jacob turned to her, his heart aching at the sight of her so frail and broken. He stepped forward, gently cupping her face in his hands. "We're going to make it out of this," he said firmly. "I won't let anything happen to you. Do you hear me?" Evelyn stared at him for a moment before nodding weakly. "Okay," she whispered. The nurse, still shaken but resolute, gestured toward the exit. "The door's clear now," she said. "If we leave through the service entrance, we can get to the parking lot." Jacob nodded and stepped to Evelyn's other side, helping Dr. Bennett support her weight. Together, they began moving down the corridor, their footsteps echoing ominously in the stillness. Every creak of the floor and flicker of the lights set their nerves on edge, but they pressed on, driven by sheer willpower. As they approached the exit, Jacob felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at him from the shadows. But there was nothing, just the faint hum of the emergency lights and the distant sound of their footsteps. "We're almost there," Dr. Bennett said, his voice tight with urgency. "Just a little farther." But just as they reached the door, Evelyn let out a sharp gasp, her body convulsing in their arms. Jacob and Dr. Bennett stopped in their tracks, lowering her gently to the floor. "What's happening?" Jacob demanded, his voice tinged with panic. Dr. Bennett quickly checked her pulse, his brow furrowing in concern. "She's in shock," he said. "Her body's been through too much." "No," Evelyn rasped, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gripped Jacob's arm with surprising strength. It's not shock. It's them." Jacob's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Evelyn's breathing grew more labored, her body trembling as tears streamed down her face. "I can still feel them," she said, her voice breaking. They're not gone." "Not completely." Jacob stared at her, his mind racing. "But the ritual—" "It wasn't enough," Evelyn interrupted, her voice growing fainter. "It weakened them, but it didn't destroy them. They're still connected to me." Dr. Bennett exchanged a worried glance with Jacob. "What do we do?" he asked. Jacob looked down at the journal, his hands trembling as he flipped through the pages. The cryptic text and fragmented diagrams seemed to blur together, mocking him with their incompleteness. He felt a surge of frustration and despair. How were they supposed to fight something they didn't even understand? Evelyn's grip on his arm tightened, pulling him from his thoughts. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's only one way to end this." Jacob shook his head, his chest tightening. "No," he said firmly. "There has to be another way." Evelyn managed a faint smile, though her eyes were filled with pain. "You've always been stubborn," she said. "But you know I'm right. You've seen what they can do. If we let them live, they'll destroy everything. Jacob felt tears welling up in his eyes as he stared at her. "I can't lose you," he said, his voice breaking. "Not like this." "You won't lose me," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "I'll always be with you. But this is the only way." Dr. Bennett knelt beside them, his expression grim. "What do you need us to do?" he asked. Evelyn looked at Jacob, her gaze unwavering. "You need to finish the ritual," she said. "But this time, you have to include me. I'm the connection. If you sever it, they'll be gone for good." Jacob's hands trembled as he clutched the journal. He wanted to scream, to fight, to find some other solution. But deep down, he knew she was right. The creatures weren't just monsters. They were a part of her. And as long as that connection remained, they would never truly be gone. "Okay," he said finally, his voice shaking. "Okay, we'll do it." Dr. Bennett and the nurse worked quickly, clearing a space on the floor and gathering whatever supplies they could find. Jacob redrew the symbols from the ritual, his hands steady despite the tears streaming down his face. He added new lines, new connections, guided by Evelyn's trembling instructions. As he worked, Evelyn lay on the floor, her body growing weaker with each passing moment. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, but she forced herself to stay conscious, her willpower stronger than her failing body. When the circle was complete, Jacob knelt beside her, his hands gently cradling her face. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. "I'm ready," she said. "Finish it." Jacob pressed a kiss to her forehead, his tears falling onto her pale skin. Then he stood, clutching the journal tightly as he began to recite the chant. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with an otherworldly energy. The symbols on the floor began to glow, their light pulsating in time with Jacob's words. Evelyn's body convulsed as the connection between her and the creatures was severed, the pain etched across her face. Outside the circle, the nurse and Dr. Bennett watched in stunned silence as the light intensified, filling the room with a blinding brilliance. The ground trembled beneath them, and a deafening roar echoed through the hospital as the creatures let out one final, collective scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. The room fell silent, the air still and heavy. Jacob collapsed to his knees, his body racked with sobs as he cradled Evelyn's lifeless form. Her face was peaceful, her pain finally gone. He pressed his forehead to hers, his tears soaking her hair. Dr. Bennett placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder, his own eyes filled with grief. "She saved us," he said softly. "She saved everyone." Jacob didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of his loss was too great, the pain too raw. He clutched the journal tightly, vowing to ensure that her sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. In the days that followed, the hospital was evacuated and sealed off, the events of that night buried under layers of red tape and official denials. The survivors, few as they were, carried the scars of what they had witnessed, both physical and emotional. Jacob returned home, his life forever changed. He spent hours poring over the journal, determined to uncover its secrets and ensure that the creatures could never return. Evelyn's sacrifice weighed heavily on him, but it also gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting. And yet, as he sat in his dimly lit apartment one night, the journal open before him, he felt a familiar unease creep over him. The air grew heavy, and the shadows in the room seemed to shift and move. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as he turned toward the corner of the room. There, in the darkness, a pair of glowing eyes stared back at him. The nightmare wasn't over.